Welcome, Iancu, to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you, John.
You're
Thanks
very
so much
welcome.
for the invitation.
We met a few years ago on a panel event that we were talking about to a bunch of internal auditors, funnily enough, and we were speaking broadly around a growing environmental consciousness, shall we say, within financial services specifically. And I think from memory, I somehow managed to shoehorn in the topic of Brexit and its implications, and looking after jobs regionally, whilst also somehow shoehorning Marcus Aurelius into the conversation. You, however, were certainly much more captivating, and during that conversation, you delivered a keynote where you described yourself as a reluctant environmentalist, someone who was pulled into corporate environmentalism. I would love to hear you unpack what you meant by reluctant environmentalist, and then we can talk a little bit about where you stand on the spectrum of corporate environmentalism.
Thank you. Yeah, I do remember that event, and in a way that will sort of talk about coming full circle. You know, when internal auditors are thinking about climate risk, that is telling you something about the zeitgeist and how things are moving. And I think it opens up a particular kind of space, broadly speaking, whereby people who might not necessarily be so keen on picket lines and megaphones might still try to channel some of their thinking and their energies in around sustainability. That's sort of how I found myself. I'm reminded of that joke of the guy who says, I'm against public protests, I just don't know how to show it. And something about that, I've had something to do with the upbringing. So I grew up in Romania, which is still in Europe, I think, one of the relatively unusual countries in having actually wild nature. Bears, wolves, not just, sort of small game. They still exist in dwindling numbers, and that's a different conversation. But there's that exposure and that sort of looming sense, I think, of the importance and the value of nature. Growing up, my parents in particular, they too had found themselves coming closer to environmentalism. They were doctors by training, but they became very involved with conservation, with journalism and activism. I sort of had rescue bears and wolves as pets, actually, if we can call them pets. Not quite pets, but they were around. So as a kid, you don't always appreciate that. That can sometimes be scary. That's a different form of being a reluctant environmentalist. You don't always want to go into the pen and feed the wolves, even though they were very friendly, actually. But that said, over time, we've spoken about this. I know both of us have an interest, like you mentioned, Marcus Aurelius. I studied philosophy for a while, then shifted more to public policy and environmental policy, and was fortunate enough after my master's to get a job with a think tank called Carbon Tracker. And if your listeners will know them, that's great. If not, definitely worth checking them out. What I think they did was pioneer a new kind of environmental thinking. And in particular, now everyone uses this phrase stranded assets. Carbon Tracker were the first to coin the term and to put research behind it. And the thinking basically was, you might have investments. Obvious examples might be, say, a new coal-fired power plant built today, which might either be shut down prematurely because of their environmental profile, or might fail to deliver the sort of planned returns you were hoping to get from them, again, partly because of regulations and the environmental profile. Think of something like the carbon taxes that power plants need to pay in the EU and in other jurisdictions, right? And why I think Carbon Tracker were quite successful were exactly because they did not try to appeal to, shall we call them, external motives. They did not try to make bankers think so much about the polar bears. They tried to reframe the conversation in terms of financial risk. Given certain assets listed on the stock exchange, is there a possibility of certain things, if you put together the costs and the carbon, coming closer to do this, closer to financial modeling and trying to speak the risk language in financial terms, as opposed to the more morally driven, shall we say altruistic, although you can argue it's self-interest, it's not protecting the planet, it's protecting our society in some sense, that what's actually at stake here. But that was a different kind of environmentalism that I think was emerging. And I was fortunate to be with Carbon Tracker exactly at the moment when there was a cusp of change, I think, in financial markets. So regulators were starting to talk about this, central banks were starting to talk about climate risks. It was partly actually a following Carbon Tracker research. And I've tried to sort of inhabit this particular world where you do think of different levers of influence. You think of your voice as a shareholder, you think of potential impact through doing research, analysis, other kinds of networking and advocacy, again, not always in the public square. And I think there is an avenue for that. You can probably think of the sort of good cop, bad cop metaphor here as well. You obviously need activists, as they say, to be realistic and demand the impossible. But at the same time, I think you have a different kind of language. And indeed, I think capital markets, to some degree, we can just debate how far, in the corporate world more generally, have taken up some of the idea that you do have to bring in an element of climate risk into your own plans, that you do have to serve budgets slightly differently, you allocate capital differently. And I think some of the industrial sectors, transports, utilities, autos, but also other industrial parts, are thinking a bit more seriously about the decarbonization of their sort of operations, how they do business, in a way which is not just, the marketing department gets some money to plant some trees and produce lovely little reports with tiny hands holding little shoots of green shoots coming out from mounds of earth. That's been the sort of reluctant environmentalism that I've been talking about. And it's more not to do with the sort of a reluctance on the issues. The more time passes, I think it's ultimately clear that there is a sense of urgency that needs to be injected in the conversation, despite the sort of lilting tone in which I'm saying this. That said, we can maybe come to that in a bit. Nuance is needed here as well. What kinds of things are urgent over which timelines, and what other things might be imperative, maybe morally, even if not urgent in the same sense? Your duty, you might need to do your duty, not necessarily because it's urgent that you do your duty, but because it's the right thing. These are interesting conversations, and maybe we can explore some of that, because obviously how they apply and what are the limits to which you can hope that they apply in the corporate setting, in the financial world. I think that's an interesting sort of thing to maybe unpick at.
Yeah, I think so too, because the financial sector clearly focusing on financial risk, and it makes you ask the question whether it's possible for financial services firms to be able to take account of those non-financial things well. So if you think about that opening gambit, you're growing up in Romania, you talked about the sense of still being among the natural world because you're surrounded still by big flora and fauna, which many in the more developed parts of Europe, and by that we mean the parts of Europe which have been concreted over, don't necessarily have that sense.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder whether it's possible for, whether it's just corporates in general, actually, who are trying to spend time quantifying, measuring, turning into metrics and targets the landscape of, it's probably the wrong term, of the natural world, to then decide how to make decisions on it when it doesn't quite capture other parts of our relationship to nature, apart from how it is that we use it as a resource.
Well, there's a lot in very sort of rich, interesting things. Maybe we can take them. I think there are at least 2 or 3 things worth unpacking separately. So one, I think, is this distinction, or whether it is a distinction actually, between so-called financial and non-financial factors. This has always been a big debate in finance about what the limits are, what your legal duties are, this concept of fiduciary duty, and how that interplays with what you should and shouldn't be looking at. There's a slightly different point around whether or not metrics and the kind of mindset that keeps analyzing and wants to sort of have a number, really, a table, a chart. There's a kind of, how shall I say, there's sort of an imaginary, there's a certain kind of thing we've gotten used to in society, and they're like, how butchers, when they first trying to pretend they were doctors, got paraphernalia, they got their white coats and something like that. There is an element that is how serious people do certain things, and it may indeed to your point, actually lose sight of actually perhaps the most important things. It's one of my bugbears, actually, that quite often on sustainability conferences, there's usually a person that comes in and with a sort of serious tone, as if they're imparting deep wisdom, will say, what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. And I always found that stuff to be relatively like trite or banal. I can think of loads of things which are actually very important and are manageable, relationships, for example, and you don't measure them. And that's particularly true when you think of something like nature, right? It's a sort of, again, maybe we'll come and unpack all these three things separately, because there's a sort of growing debate now that there's some sort of inroads have been made on the carbon question. People are substituting energy sources, the costs are falling, certain things are falling in place to make that possible. So building on that success, now there's a growing movement to say, well, we need to expand from carbon, this kind of narrow carbon focus, to nature, all of which is true and sort of to be encouraged. But it's not necessarily true that the mechanisms through which they're trying to elicit this change are suited to the task, because a lot of it has to do with this idea of metrics and reporting. You need to report on your biodiversity KPIs. And that very notion in itself, I think, can be problematic. It's the whole idea of taking something live and complex and interrelated and turning it into something relatively lifeless. Like, how many species do you have here? And it's a sort of weird thing. Like, there's an analogy in the Bible, in the book of Job, right, where God tests Job's faith by partly making him very miserable, but killing his entire family. And at the end of the book, it's sort of, well, things come full circle, and God is like, no, I'll give you a new family, don't worry. And something's lost in that substitution. And I think something can be lost, again, if you're just tallying nature a certain way and counting certain things a certain way. Maybe we'll come to that, but I think it's a much broader conversation. I think it has to do, maybe we can open up some interesting ideas around the psychology of it rather than purely the numbers. But to go back to the starting point, the limits or the appropriateness of thinking about this financial, non-financial distinction, I think, have been an interesting subject which ebbed and flowed, right? So what I found is, in a way, it's not the distinction I don't find particularly helpful. I'd argue these two things blur into one another and they evolve over time. There are certain things, as policymakers' attention shifts, as the public interest shifts, things become material and therefore financial, and other things, as the overtone windows moves in different directions, they may lose materiality. So I never thought these mental models where you have things which are clearly financial in this bucket and clearly non-financial in the other, it's actually very hard to come up with obvious examples of things which are only in one and not the other. Outside, obviously, the things that go on the balance sheet. Of course, yes, your income obviously has clear links to, the valuation of a company and things like that. But, employee satisfaction, I think every sort of management consultant there will say, look, this is something you don't measure it in the same way, but it's obviously core to the company, and yet where do you put it? So I think that's also true for something like the environment. Does it even make sense in a world like today where, but not trivial example, it's significant, but every ton of carbon that industrial companies emit, at least in Europe, but also in the UK, you pay a relatively significant price for it, right? Several dozens or even 100 euros it was earlier this year. What does that make the environment or environmental performance, right? Is it about saving the planet, or is it about sort of looking after your balance sheet? It's not clear, far from it. And in a way, I found that the mental models whereby certain decision makers, for example, say the trustees of pension funds, if they place you, quote unquote, in you're the climate stuff, you're the environmental people, the polar bears, they have a mental model of that, they disengage. And it's interesting that even the law, I think, recognizes that to some degree. So if you remember, there was a few years ago this report from the Law Commission about the fiduciary duty, and one of the examples was around investing in tobacco. Now, I happen to think the whole conversation of whether investment in tobacco and guns and all that is usually where the conversation goes to die, particularly around sustainability. But for the purposes of the argument, it was explicit in that report that people said, look, if someone says, I don't want to invest in tobacco because cigarettes kill people, that's not permissible for a pension fund trustee, because you're outstepping your bounds, right? You're stepping into sort of non-financial considerations. But if they were to say, because cigarettes kill people, there is growing regulatory scrutiny, which might make cigarette investments less profitable over time, then you're making a financial case. And that would therefore allow a trustee to make certain kinds of judgments, if that is the rationale. But if you sort of step outside the legalese, it isn't like basically saying the same thing. And it's just a matter of perspective here. And that's the point I'm trying to make, ultimately, that these distinctions are more permeable than I think is sometimes thought. Now, whether or not there is a tendency to sort of overemphasize financial relevance, I think that's also a life potential in the issue in the industry. And with all this growth of reporting, you have to report on this and that and that and the other. I think you have a lot of essay writing, which is basically happening. And the essay writing follows something in this general vein. You can imagine something we don't like about society. We think that it might be pervasive. Therefore, it affects many potential countries, regions, and markets. And therefore, the next step is to say, and this is some sort of a systemic risk, therefore. And it affects particularly diversified investors or something like that. And of course, you can imagine such situations, various issues lead to, the social fabric unraveling, economies crumbling. You can make these arguments. It's not to say that's not true, but then the burden of proof is sometimes lowered in virtue of this fact that the boundary is porous. So occasionally, I don't want to over sort of egg the point. There is an intuitive distinction between financial and non-financial, but it's not as clear cut. And I think that is partly both the art and the science of people in charge of navigating risk, of setting company strategy right, how to think about what may be coming down the track. And one interesting example, there's a steel company who, at the time when these carbon credits that you have to buy from particularly in the EU, they were very, very cheap. That price went even to zero at some point. So people didn't really trust in the market that this will be something which will really actually make a difference over time in changing the direction of carbon pollution for industrials. But there was at least one steel company that said, look, I think this will grow over time. So they actually amassed a small war chest of such allowances. And it became hugely, hugely valuable over time because they didn't sort of relegate the carbon conversation to the social responsibility department. It was actually, the proper people in the treasury who were thinking about it. You do have such examples where I think that can be very live conversation. And then, of course, you can have policy shifts and sort of behavioral shifts more generally, which again, implode that distinction. Probably a live example for most people would be, I don't think we were talking as much about plastics, for example, as we did almost all of a sudden after David Attenborough's shows, right? And all of a sudden, corporates were thinking about their supply chain, changing this, recycling that. I'm not saying this necessarily always has the impact claimed, but it is one of these examples where something really catapults to the forefront quite quickly, right? This is still within the climate space. We can probably think of other social examples more recently. So that's one side of it. Now, indeed, whether or not we sort of only, at least implicitly, equate financial relevance with things which can be measured or quantified, that's, I think, the sort of open-ended debate right now. And whether or not, until you will have measured something, you can say you've taken account of it, is the kind of interesting debate that's happening now. And I think that, particularly again with carbon, it's a very live issue. And both with investing too, actually. One ambiguity in the word to take into account something is you can take it into account, but nevertheless have overriding circumstances, right? I mean, this is being facetious, but it's a bit like when you're a kid and you go to your grandma and she says, I've taken your view into account, but you still can go out to play. You can take into account climate factors, but nevertheless say they are overruled by other things in certain kinds of particular circumstances. Live example, in the aftermath of Ukraine. Yes, trying to secure additional LNG, liquefied natural gas, might increase the carbon footprint of certain kinds of power suppliers or countries more generally. Nevertheless, in light of energy security concerns, that might be taken into account. It's one of these examples. The word has an ambiguity, which, in a way, there's a kind of movement from sort of the regulatory side to try and stamp it out a little bit. And I wonder how successful such efforts can be. For example, by defining greenwashing, such that it's very, very clear if you are or aren't taking things into account. That's a kind of, I wonder how far that can go. And of course, that opens up the other conversation of whether if only what you can measure becomes seen as sort of significant, then what about the things you're leaving out in the context of nature?
But before we get there, because not everyone will be familiar with terms like greenwashing, what is greenwashing?
Well, this is a
And I know, having looked from the outside in, that the
The
greenwashing
challenge I
definition
have,
keeps on growing and growing and growing. So we probably want to try and find something as relatively punchy without doing the whole thing down. But I'm not too sure that's possible at this point.
well, this is exactly it, and I'll tell you why. I think that the immediate intuitive understanding is to say, look, you are either lying about or trying to magnify the perceived sustainability or greenness of claims made around a certain kind of product or service. I think that would be the definition, right? If you look under the hood, what turns out is there is not actually as green as what is claimed on the outside. And it's a very vague definition, but I think there's something very deep about why this is a vague definition in this sense. In a world which, considered in its whole, in terms of the technologies available, the strength of policies, consumer appetites or willingness, political will, all these things, in a world where there are multiple signs, alarm bells ringing, that the general path of the world is not, for want of a better word, sustainable, you have a question about how to think about the parts, the constituent parts in this world. So, for example, airlines. Few of us, travel, broadly speaking, demand for flying is growing, both here and in emerging markets. There is a lack of either available at scale, as you know, or at least cheap available substitute fuel to kerosene. The so-called sustainable aviation fuel exists. We've just had the first transatlantic flight on it, but really the quantities supply is very, very small and expensive. Okay, so if you have something like that, and then you have an airline that decides to offset some of its emissions, and let's assume for the sake of argument that they actually generally do more than any other competitor and actually make sure they buy credible projects, not, they're not inflated. They're actually helping create plantaries or do things which would otherwise not have happened, and there are sort of standards and rigor around it. Now, how should we think about such an airline? Is it greenwashing because it's obviously still burning tons and tons of kerosene, but trying to do something to compensate it? Or is it not? Should it actually be rewarded because compared to the rest of its peers who are not doing anything in that space, it's doing a lot more? And this tension between absolute and relative claims runs through the heart of greenwashing, I think. There are some very obvious examples where you can pretty much tell, look, this is just nothing. I can think of one example of an oil company who had this ad, and it was Trafalgar Square, and next to Nelson's Column, there was this big, giant balloon. And the tagline ran, "Imagine capturing this much carbon every day." And then someone helpfully made a proper illustration to scale, which had this huge balloon, vastly, I don't know how many, tens or hundreds of times larger than this small balloon. Well, it was a big balloon, but one which was much, much larger. And it had the correct caption, which said, yeah, but imagine releasing this much CO2 every day. So things like that, when a company really only tries to emphasize what is a marginal, say, allocation in their R&D budgets or in something else and try to really big it up. I remember I could hardly open up my LinkedIn profile without seeing the ads of one of the big US oil majors about their investment in biofuels and green algae and things. And by their own admission, this was always going to be something very peripheral to their allocation. There was 1% of your investments, 100% of your ads type of thing. So that kind of greenwashing exists. In some sense, it's increasing, and that should probably be reined in by regulators. But you do face this issue that I think outside this kind of procedural definition, that you make certain claims which don't stack up. If you try to actually specify what these claims need to look like to really define greenwashing once and for all, I think that's something which is a bit like trying to nail Jello to the wall. There's a lot of focus from regulators in trying to do it, but I kind of worry a little bit that this problem, that by forcing people to report more on this, that, and the other, you're still not able to pin down greenwashing because it's partly and irrevocably in the eye of the beholder. And I don't mean to say anything goes by that. Obviously, there are limits, there are carbon budgets, there are constraints. But outside that, it's, you can fill in, if you say the world must only emit a certain amount of carbon pollution generally, how you allocate that between different companies, entities, actors, and there are a million ways to put that piece of the puzzle together. There's no single correct way, which therefore sort of implies there's no single green standard in that sense. This is my view. It's not necessarily a widespread view, but I do worry that you can waste time trying to define the undefinable sometimes.
And I think that perhaps links us back to at least what we're about to unpack of the what gets measured gets managed, and wanting to push back on that. And I think the reason why it links back to it is much of the thrust of this conversation, we've talked about how in efforts to regulate, which is typically focused on getting companies to report ad infinitum and ad nauseum on every aspect of their business, is without any sunset clause as to when a regulation might reach its point of actually that's enough now. We've drawn a line in the sand, but actually what happens is we have this unquenchable thirst for data, and a whole regulatory apparatus, and thus the bureaucracy that is building in every single organization in which to respond to it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And some of these points you've talked about, which is how is it that we end up developing the things that we need to actually live in a way that isn't as negatively impacting of our society, the environments in which each of us live at whichever point on the planet, is actually just being taken up by let's just have all of our resources, or at least the lion's share of them, going toward producing these reports. Those reports, which are looking like fancy PDF documents with lots of wind turbines and those hands held out holding a little green earth, as you said. And I wonder at what point there will be, if ever, a sunset clause from some of the largest organizations. I mean, the European Union is a great example, where when is enough enough? When is it that we go, actually, maybe we don't just keep on trying to quench our thirst for every single type of data before we can get to making any kind of decision? And maybe, because there's another point in there which you made me think about this at the end when you were talking about how greenwashing is in the eye of the beholder, and not in a relativistic way, but rather it makes me go, well, the thing is a lot of what is driving at least some regulators, or what drives businesses insane, is people can't get their head around acting according to a principle or a set of principles, even though like that's generally what it means to live in accordance with any kind of values. But people want the letter rather than the spirit. And I think we're potentially building this big tower of Babel of language, impenetrable language, and management techniques in which to say, yeah, we've done a great job, all the while looking around and going, I'm not too sure that we have done a great job.
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many important issues there. There's one. Will you indulge a bit of sort of historical or, well, fantasy storytelling on the stop? So, are you familiar with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? But I think there's a twist in the way it's usually told or interpreted. Most people think, what's the problem with it? Well, you have this young wizard apprentice who makes the spell he sort of overheard, and the spell backfires on him, right? And he doesn't know how to stop it. And everyone sort of says, well, look, the problem here clearly is the lack of training. He didn't know enough. He lacked the spell that would stop things. And I think that, well, that's true as far as it goes, but there's a deeper moral, which is usually misunderstood here. My take on that story is we should always assume we don't know, in some sort of sense, the solution, the magic spell. So therefore, you should try and construct boundaries that minimize potential damage. And that's always true. It's not that the apprentice didn't know it and the master did. The master, in some sense, is also bound by things. And what I mean by that is the importance of this stopping rule as a general clause, as a sort of design principle in many things, and indeed in social policy. It's becoming increasingly harder to articulate exactly that, like to even know when you've made progress. So, for example, the word systemic is bandied a lot these days. I remember the days when to even suggest climate change is a systemic risk was seen as relatively unorthodox because Basel regulations specified something about only certain kinds of risks which could really spread out throughout the entirety of the financial system very, very quickly. Think like subprime mortgages vanishing, right? And then it's sort of, no, people sort of broadly will broaden the definition of it. And I'd still say the reason this is climate is something systemic issue is because you can think of all the touch points in the system whereby the burning of carbon in particular is linked to all sorts of other activities. It's literally permeated the entirety of the economic system. The flip side of that argument, however, is that I can think of a metric that will tell me, in some sense, where we've made enough progress. If emissions are reduced by this much by that time, I will vaguely know if we're in the right direction or not. And of course, you don't always have that in other places. Now, I've just said you don't always or need metrics or can have metrics, but what I'm trying to get at is that we don't often pay enough attention to this problem of we introduce things when you roll them back. And you see this, you can roll through corporate websites and you see at the bottom various disclosures or statements. We can sort of see are the sort of legacy regimes that you need to have a certain kind of statement in a certain part of the website. I sometimes wonder whether those statements actually lead to someone, apart from a compliance person, updating them tirelessly every year. Is management doing something about that? No, there's just some other reporting requirement, right? And that seems to be the case here as well, and in sustainability at least. As far as it goes, I think the strength of the argument would be something like sunlight is the best disinfectant, that by telling people you need to bring out certain things in the light, they will do something about the things they're supposed to report on. And I think there's some evidence that is occasionally happening. There's a Banque de France study about something about like showing your dirty hands or something like that is the title. And that's the main point, that merely asking certain kinds of institutions to report on certain kinds of financial exposures mean they reduce them over time to certain high polluting industries. However, there are limits, I think, to that argument because of the broader incentive structures. If it's become, if it's still profitable to invest in certain kinds of things as opposed to certain kinds of other things, reporting on it may not fundamentally all completely change the balance of incentives here, right? So that theory that more reporting and more disclosure of more metrics is the driving force, I think is problematic. It does come back to your point on principles again. It's like, in some sort of sense, although governments seem to now have a newfound taste for industrial policy, we have slightly shrunk back from this idea of sort of big social goals pursuit, all guns blazing. You occasionally hear of this kind of moonshot language, Manhattan Project type of thing, but it's sort of whittled down a little bit from the public discourse, and it's become much more managerial, optimizing for this versus that, disclosing on this. It's a sort of kind of different mindset. And it does seem to me at some level that it can be a bit of a band-aid. I mean, for what it's worth, I've been heartened that despite all this talk of, after the invasion of Russia, the world's going back to coal and all such narratives, if you actually look at the people actually tracking policies and which policies are introduced where and in what direction, the number of climate policies, at least, has strengthened. And sorry, not just the number, sort of the magnitude as well. So the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine globally has actually meant people are doubling down on trying to reduce exposure or dependence to fossil fuels. So there is a stronger policy signal, which is not just disclosures. But it is also, I found it as an interesting anecdote that if you followed, I'm sure you have actually, in the US, right, there was a big package of laws passed to stimulate the growth of the clean economy, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And the EU was already for a few years developing their own version of what is and isn't a green investment, right? The green taxonomy. And it's a big classification system, as you know. And the moment when the IRA in the US was passed, Europe had to scramble a little bit to come up with a response. And they didn't say, well, we need to define what is green, what we need to invest in. You have this list, consult that list. No, they said, okay, yeah, you will get more subsidies if you're investing in wind and solar and electrolyzers and batteries and hydrogen. They knew what the things to be done were. They didn't sort of go back and say, let's do a consultation. It was quite clear that when there is political will, you can sort of bypass some of the procedural elements and to go straight into incentivizing the goals you want, right? Where this becomes challenging, and I realize there's a reason for all this reporting language, is obviously, at least in the finance world, there's historically been a reluctance to tell people what to do, and for very good reasons. You probably wouldn't want, nor would I, someone the government moving my pension money or something like that. So you try and cajole institutions through this reporting and disclosure language, hoping that over time, say, channels more investments into social or productive enterprises or other things, or local investments, or that kind of worry. But again, there is a question of how far that can go in the absence of different kind of policy measures or structural constraints.
There's a whole lot there, and the sticking on corporate reporting for a moment, and those measures of success. And I want to make sure I don't lose any listeners to this, because corporate reporting isn't the most sexy of things. But I want to drag this down into the real world, which is, let's think about the drive for sustainable buildings, net zero buildings. And you can probably quite easily, with a selection of metrics, show that a building is very energy efficient. And so that equals good, equals we're achieving our mission. But as someone who visits London, a once great built environment, and then looks at a lot of the cities that exist in Europe or further afield, and many of those mega cities popping up in all parts of the world, that effectively are copy and paste of each other. You know, these big glass and steel structures have got absolutely no link to people, place, culture, history, straight out of an abstraction, an abstracted head of an architect who seems to be trying to impress other architects, but doesn't seem to actually capture a sense of a place. And yet, if I go and think about the buildings that are still standing strong in our cities 200, 300 years, 400 years later, they're stone built. You know, they kind of self-regulate their temperature in some respects. Yeah, they need a little bit of retrofitting here and there. They need to be looked after. And whilst this isn't a policy to say start building everything in stone, what I'm trying to get to the point of is what the buildings of our, you know, pre-1945 past represented was often the story of the people that lived there for a very, and that has been lost. And yeah, I think it's very important. There are some people who even try and make the point that for social cohesion, you need to have a built environment which feels like home. And there's someone called Marwa Al-Sabuni who's written extensively about what she thinks was a very negative impact in her home country of Syria of modern architecture, which was built unapologetically and without thinking about it in long, organically grown neighborhoods with bazaars and all of those things, and vocational buildings. And all of a sudden, these straight line buildings arrived. And she genuinely makes a link in some of her books that it led to a bit of a social breakdown. Now, what I'm not suggesting here that we need to go down that big dystopian rabbit hole, but what I am suggesting is a similar link, which is the people who are creating the regulatory mechanisms for which all of us ought to follow, and then we keep on wanting to keep on growing more and more and more of them, are sitting in glass and steel structures, air conditioned in some distant cosmopolis somewhere, have zero link to the people and places in which you're going to predominantly have to carry these things out and report back to them and bring them into being. Don't really know actually what the downstream real-term environmental real-life impacts are going to be. And a kind of, to borrow a Paul Kingsnorth phrase, is there's a kind of narcissism in modern humanity where we're entombed in our cities and we speak only to ourselves. This idea that we're throwing lots of impenetrable jargon around and coming up with all these really clever systems of governance in this distant place, but it doesn't capture any of those other things that we talked about a little bit earlier, of what does it mean to be human, and what makes us feel at home and comfortable and connected. Instead, it's let's deal with all of our biggest issues of the day purely through technocratic means, which is to say, big building full of technical experts, siloed expertise, all theoretically very, very great, and can be proved out theoretically, but has absolutely no view as to what the downstream impact is going to be on, say, a built environment. What do you think about any of that stuff?
Wow, I mean, you can imagine, and we've spoken about this before. There's so much I resonate with, and from sort of different angles. One, I mean, I'm Romanian by background, as I've mentioned, and it struck me coming to the UK how, what people here sometimes refer to as brutalism in architecture. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the stuff that Ceausescu built when he was razing down sort of old legacy Belle Epoque buildings in the center of Bucharest and was replacing them with relatively horrible um, concrete, poorly designed buildings, right? There is an element of that ethos of modernism, which is a philosophical problem. And, thank God, like Paris was sort of was saved. Le Corbusier had these big plans of raising big chunks of central Paris and making some of his own sort of putting his own modernistic stamp on it. And thank God he wasn't successful in that. And I don't know if you've come across, there's a book, I forgot the title, something like Madness and Modernity or something like that. And I think it's written by a psychologist who comes up with this unusual example that the drawings of schizophrenics and people with brain lesion, with brain damage, often resemble kind of sketches of modernist art. You know how if you ask someone who has a sort of certain kinds of afflictions to draw, say, a clock, and the numbers all in the wrong place, or they're all clustered in one corner or something like that. So there are certain kinds of patterns in these distortions that happen for certain kinds of lesions to the brain. And particularly with schizophrenia in particular, that turns out that, yes, there's something in that perception of space maps onto some of the elements of the sort of modernist aesthetic. And it does, as someone who spends a lot of their time actually exactly comparing numbers and looking at that, I think a lot about the sort of companies I have to deal with. And often it's exactly a game of looking at the charts and the numbers, and are their numbers better than someone else's numbers? Occasionally when you step back and say, yeah, but what's the soul of this activity? And that is also true I think, in the built environment, right? You often walk around and you walk into certain modern offices and they're touted, they tout their sustainability credentials, which in some sort of sense are true in terms of better resource use or recycling or all of that. And yet there's this sort of niggling sense of, well, and yet something is missing. One thing that bothers me in particular is this lack of ornamentations. It's almost like it's an overhead now, right? Why would you bother spending time? One, obviously, prefab materials and certain things which are simpler in design. It's just add to the cost. And you compare that to some of the older, I don't know, I'm thinking of Antoni Gaudi or some of that sort of design. And obviously that's, it's a waste from a sort of pure cost benefit analysis, but it does enrich the soul, in my view, to have that explicit pursuit in some sense of beauty. Now, I realize this sounds maybe a bit reactionary, but there is something, I think, about that. And I think even the sustainability mindset has been captured, weirdly enough, and perverted by this. So there's an exhibition actually not too far from where I live, and it's all about, it's built, it's literally it's served, the BBC, it has this kind of immersive show type of experience thing, and they're outside of it, there are all sorts of little side exhibits and things. And it struck me walking through it how even the imagery, the imagination has been impoverished. The best you could come up with is the same glass designs, but maybe with a hanging garden or something like that. And even more so, there was another show on one of the museums had this whole gallery, something at the Barbican, I forgot, Our Time on Earth or something like that. And so much of it, again, was about immersive VR experiences when you look at kind of designed things, world removed from the actual sense of sustainability as embedded in some sort of natural place or human place. This sort of uprootedness, this abstraction seems to be creeping and sort of spreading more and more, I find, in that conversation. So to your point on, I think this is ultimately coming back to, and may actually be the defining conversation, whether or not we can rescue a broader sense of sustainability beyond just sort of operational performance or things like that, but trying to make it talk to sort of local places to local communities and local environments in this broad sense, I think that remains kind of the ultimate challenge. And to the degree to which you have something like quote unquote a backlash, I think it is partly a reaction to this sense that it may be sort of bureaucratic, top down, quote unquote. I hate the word agenda. I don't think that's right, actually. But this sense that, you have relatively standardized units and measures of analysis and everything shall be judged by that. And implicit, of course, there are many threads in that. There's also this kind of techno-solutionism as one idea. And, you could argue that the modern office may just as be a soulless environment, even if you switch the power to a different kind of low carbon source. So there's something about the modern office, which actually is, will time travelers from the future come back to be a 21st century office worker? Maybe not, right? There's something about that experience which needs rethinking.
Well, yes, and I totally agree, and I think it's because that, unlike say a cathedral, so the modern office is, and all those examples you just outlined, they are the production of that utilitarian mindset. The let's maximize some kind of usefulness and efficiency, and that is, well, and I know you're an Ian McGilchrist fan.
Finally.
Finally, we managed to shoehorn Ian McGilchrist
Yes.
in here. He talks about Max Shaler's hierarchy or pyramid of values, where he talks about the utility and pleasure being at the bottom of that pyramid. At the very top are holy and sacred values, and then beneath it, intellectual and values. But basically what he's saying is it's all been inverted. And so we've gotten, well, we don't even know about the things at the top anymore, but the ones at the bottom have risen right to the top. They're the things that we place most primacy on. And you can see that by going and sticking one of our modern offices for a prestigious company, go and put that next to, well, I know it's not directly comparable, but go and stick it next to a religious building, go and stick it next to a cathedral, which utility and efficiency are not even really coming into it. It is almost every part of human experience and things that, and the things that the human soul strives for. But not just that, it does actually bring together all of the really interesting intellectual stuff, right? So it's got theology carved into stone. It uses every branch of science and mathematics to make sure it actually stands up. It's got human ingenuity and freedom to be able to, as you talked about, the ornamentation, which didn't just come from some blueprint plan, which people had to follow like an IKEA instruction manual, but was people genuinely were bathed in this way of seeing, being, and understanding the world, which formed a thread throughout their lives. Whether it was telling this through the story in the West's case, the biblical scripture, and that would find expression in stone. But think about the difference between walking into a cathedral, and I mean one built in that style rather than some of the terrible utilitarian ones you can see built post-war, and that sense of awe. Non-religious people or people who say they are part of the nones, there is still a reason why, even when churches are emptying out throughout the West, that go and look at where all the tourists go. The places are still absolutely heaving. People are still drawn to them. And the reason for that is it makes us sing within. And I'm not saying that an office has to go that far and has to start doing those things. That they serve different purposes. But a whitewashed corporate office is not going to get people to think in a particularly inspired way. And back to that point of people seeing the world through virtual reality and effectively just having all of their experience mediated by screens, all their communication mediated by screens, that we spend our lives in these little virtual worlds that we're building for ourselves and see the world through just data, these little splices of reality. Again, at McGilchrist's point, this left hemispheric idea of breaking the world down into understandable parts. But the thing is once you've broken it down into as many parts as you want, you can't aggregate them together and then get a sense of what this is all about and what we ought to be doing. Is that comes from somewhere else. And this is I think what we're missing. And you're right, the sustainable people who are driven with an almost missionary zeal within the sustainability domain, regardless of um, what part of the corporate world or the political world you're in, have been taken with utilitarian ideals, but it effectively misses the whole point, which is why is it that we care so much about this stuff in the first place? Surely it isn't purely just to improve some numbers on a spreadsheet or continue the great consumerist machine.
I mean, yeah, that, absolutely. And but there are a few points where I'd come on that. So one is, I mean, we started from cathedrals. Even I'm not particularly religious, but I have a sort of an inclination and an interest in religion. And there's something noteworthy about that idea of building something which you're kind of like you're basically playing a kind of cross-generational game here. You're building something and it's only your children or your children's children that might actually see it come to fruition. This relay race, right? There's a nice book called The Good Ancestor. That's a good question. Are we being good ancestors, right? That sense that you're passing something along is a conversation that in some sort of sense, for many reasons, in my view, has to do with, the primacy of convenience and a few other things. It's not just to do with the religious sentiment. That is something that I think there are valuable lessons about that kind of mindset. It's true in architecture too. It's relatively quick to turn around buildings these days, and that's might paradoxically say you care less about form if in some sort of sense there's perhaps a sense of the temporary there or a different kind of ambition. But setting that aside, maybe we can link the McGilchrist point to what you're saying about the utilitarian ideals, because I don't know if this has been your experience. My experience has actually been that most of the people who come into sustainability are not motivated by utilitarianism. They have a sense either, they certainly have passion for the natural world, for sort of tackling certain kinds of injustices and, for improving the state of the world. So in that sense, what I think might be happening may be a bit more subtle. And, Ian McGilchrist has this point that, he talks about this broad historical narrative, how sort of civilizations grow. And he's making this point that at some point they sort of have this phase of dynamism. And then that phase, as that dynamism slightly sort of weakens, they move into this more managerial phase. They sort of roll out the metrics and the administration. And I've kept thinking about this, particularly as I'm filling all sorts of regulatory reports. I keep feeling like, yeah, we're in this phase with sustainability. There was this initial spurt of growth and enthusiasm, and the sense that, okay, maybe Milton Friedman's definition of, the only social responsibility of companies is to increase profits, even if this is an incomplete version of what he said. Maybe that was too narrow an understanding. Maybe we need to think a bit broader about stakeholder capitalism, about purpose, about all sorts of things. And it was a kind of a principles-based discussion in some sense. And weirdly enough, we've kind of been the victims of our own success in that, because, okay, sort of certain policymakers ran with it, certain institutions ran with it, and then it became like, right, well, we need to operationalize this. We need to report, we need to KPI this. And then it became very quickly bogged down. It was sort of like it was engulfed by the broader kind of machinery. And that is a challenge. And to your point, obviously, utilitarianism has this advantage that it can dominate other forms of thinking because it can sort of calculate and incorporate every kind of thing and sort of amalgamate everything into one utility calculation if you define the numbers a certain way. And that kind of implicitly makes utilitarianism the only game in town. If you go for other kinds of ethical conceptions, right? If you say, well, we should think about, I don't know, the right thing to do and the rights of the people involved, very quickly you move into almost landlocked discussion, almost sort of stalemates, right? The rights of certain communities versus other communities. Do even maybe, I don't know, does the natural world have rights? Some people make those arguments in legal cases, right? Very quickly, that's tricky. Whereas, well, at what cost should we chop this down? That's a different kind of utilitarian conversation. And I genuinely do find that because the broader kind of zeitgeist is very attuned to utilitarianism just generally. It pervades, obviously, it's a sort of bedrock of a certain kind of understanding of economics. It's so spread out in so many areas that it's becoming very hard to articulate something which is a non-utilitarian sense of sustainability. And that's precisely the challenge is sort of some of the things we're skirting around is exactly that sense of, putting a value on things which can't be valued. There's a big growing movement, as you know, to do exactly that, the sort of natural capital discussions. And the suggestion there is until we're able to put a price on various things, um, only then will we fully take them into account. And that might have some merit in some sense, but it's also actually also kind of asking the wrong question, you could argue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's this, I mean, we can bring Ian McGilchrist back into this point, which is whilst there's an element of truth to being able to look at things in a quantified way, is it's only one way in which to approach the truth. And it doesn't give you a sense of something's importance in other ways. And I wonder if there is actually a way back from that. Because that language, like natural capital, C.S. Lewis made this point in The Abolition of Man. Specifically, he was talking about the way that we reduce language as not a reflection of a deep inner sense and sensibility and feeling, but just a word. It's just a this. And so conceptions of something that is truly awesome, and not in the American awesome sense, but inspires or things that make you feel like I am truly in the presence of something sublime here, it can be dismissed. And so by framing things as natural capital, if we're just going to view everything as an economic unit, as we've talked about prior to this particular point, you can very quickly end up with a world that is impoverished in so many other ways, even if you've somehow managed to ascribe a value to it in this case.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what a fantastic book, The Abolition of Man.
It's a great book. 32 pages or something is the one I've got. I mean, it's giant. It's probably about 60 pages, but something you can get through in a read. And I think for anyone who those people working in these purpose-driven roles that suddenly find themselves surrounded by this operationalizing thinking and utilitarian thinking and think, oh, it doesn't feel like this. There's something a bit wrong with this. Go and read Abolition of Man, and you'll feel even more strongly about it. I want to do a total, well, not a total pivot. We're going to stay on the topic, but we spoke about this in the lead up to the conversation. I'm from the northeast of England. I think I might have even mentioned John Gray on 3 of the, and this is podcast number 8. On 3 of the 8 podcasts, I think I've managed to talk about John Gray and this concept because I do think it's interesting, and I actually do think there might be something to it. But I know you don't necessarily agree with it, and so I want to get into it. So, John Gray, for those who don't know and who haven't listened to the previous 7. He's probably the world's most preeminent living political philosopher. He spoke at the Unheard Club recently, and within that, the headline that came out of it, an edited excerpt of his discussion with Freddie Sayers, is that net zero is the politics of narcissism. So I'm going to read you out a couple of paragraphs of that, Iancu, and I want to get your reaction to it. I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm a disciple in that regard of a great friend who died recently, James Lovelock. He used to say that climate science is inexact, but if it has a bias, it's probably towards underestimating the speed of climate change. He thought that climate change would consist of sudden jumps and it could transform things quite quickly in a couple of decades. We might be in the middle of it. That's my view. I'm not a climate skeptic. What I am very skeptical about is net zero and the kind of conventional green policies that are being launched. Firstly, they were launched before the infrastructure was there, before the technology was developed that could make them work. No consideration was given to the fact that many of the raw materials that were needed for the inputs, the batteries and so on, were now substantially or even largely controlled by China and Africa and elsewhere. It's in Africa that the great game of the 19th century is being refought. Now, they might be found in other countries, in Sweden and America. Various deposits have been found, but they are not easily developed. And in the meantime, these programs can't go ahead, nor were the economic costs of these green programs properly assessed. There was a constant insistence that they would be job creative. Even in America, they haven't been that job creative. And remember, America is very big and can throw very large amounts of money at these things. the Green New Deal is largely a protectionist scheme. We can't do that because we're too small, we're too exposed to flows of international capital. The idea that in Britain or in Europe these programs could never possibly work, it's a bit like suffering from cancer and using candle therapy. Some people might say, but we've got to show that we're on the right side. We've got to accomplish it, even if the other people don't do it. I think that's the politics of narcissism. I want to feel good. But in the meantime, you're wasting resources and you're wasting time. There is a very serious possibility that we're now in the early stages of runaway climate change. We should be focusing everything we've got, not having an infinitesimal impact on global carbon levels, which would be the case even if the whole net zero program was implemented, on policies of adaptation. And adaptation is not going to be easy. Remember, most climate scientists agree that once human-induced climate change is in the works, it goes on for decades or even centuries. You can't just stop it. There's a general idea among environmentalists that we started this, so we can't stop it. Or so we can stop it, sorry. They are wrong. We started it probably, but we can't stop it. I've said previously we're living in an age of tragedy. I'm not too sure about that anymore. I think we've advanced further than tragedy. We're entering an age of absurdity. Consider German climate policy. Germany, as we keep hearing, is incomparably more adult, more advanced, more modern, and in every way superior to bungling Britain. But in Germany, the result of their closing down of nuclear and going for renewables has been an increased reliance on the dirtiest kind of coal. Well, this is tragic. It's even more than tragic. It's completely absurd.
Long sigh. I'm sympathetic in many ways to John Gray's other writings where he tries to sort of take a historical, in particular, a deep historical perspective around the limits of liberalism. I think he brings very many valuable insights, but in what you've just heard, there are quite a few that I like to call green herrings, which is basically a red herring, but in the context of climate. Let's start with the last one because it's very easy. It's simply not true that Germany has increased its reliance on coal. On a historical basis, Germany consumes roughly around, I don't know, a third to half the coal it did, say 20 years ago. It has temporarily, as a result of the Russian dependency and Russia cutting supplies, has temporarily increased its coal reliance. So the nuclear question is a separate question. Personally, I don't understand the extent of the virulent opposition to nuclear energy that is happening in certain environmental quarters. But let's park that for now. It's simply not true that Germany's so-called Energiewende, the energy transition, has not made a difference. It has had a huge network effect because Germany, being a pioneer in that, has actually reduced the costs for clean energy for the rest of the world, to the point where then China became interested, and then sort of China did the same thing by scaling up certain things. It's not true as a matter of just numbers that there's been no change. And the share of electricity coming from clean sources has increased in Germany. Set that aside for a moment. That's just a small point, but it is a recurring talking point about how Germany uses coal. It's not good. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying there's more to it than meets the eye. There are a few other things happening in there, and I don't know where to start. First of all, it's this idea, and it's a recurring talking point around the so-called net zero agenda. And I submit to you that's a misnomer for a number of reasons. Yes, you have certain kinds of top-down initiatives, but why do we have phones? Is it because of the digitalization agenda that was imposed by shady Silicon Valley elites and governments? Or is it because a number of forces converged? There's something happening to technology, there was something happening to consumers, and yes, of course, there's no shortage of governments imposing this app or that app or digitalizing this or that, but it's a mistake to present it as a single monolithic thing. Obviously, someone like Gray, he relatively quickly will jump to analogies of Soviet 5-year plans and that kind of top-down imposition, and I think something in his political view bristles at that kind of plan. And indeed, I come from Arena, as I've said, we've seen firsthand the sort of where those excesses can lead, where you try to pretend you know in advance exactly what happens. And indeed, one critique I will make of some of the conversations around reaching net zero emissions, is the specific point of overly reliant on a single or a few single technology pathways. The way this often works, you have large sort of models which try to say, look, these are some of the technologies we know we have available today. This is the things which are in the pipeline. You model certain things about the relative cost, and perhaps those go down over time. And that means you will reach net zero with a certain kind of mix of technologies. But that mix can be problematic. It can be, you might over-rely on carbon capture or other unproven technologies, which make it essentially a speculative bet that you will have certain things coming in to save a day, but meanwhile carry on with certain things. The whole point I make is broadly the future development of technologies is in some sense unknowable and in a deep innovation sense, right? Some of the most meaningful things which happened over the last 2 or 3 decades in energy, the shale revolution in the US and the fantastic cost of clean tech, where none of them were in any sort of models if you look back 40 or 50 years ago. So there's a lesson in that. But that too is missing a broader point, which is what I've just said about innovation, that is relevant in certain kinds of cases. In other points, just like sort of digitalization advanced, we have the technologies. They are rolling out, even in a scenario where sort of climate policy goes backwards, and there's research on this, you'll still see more clean energy because it's cheaper. You'll still see more electric vehicles, again, because they're cheaper to run. So to sort of present the entire conversation as the net zero agenda driven by bureaucrats, and that is sort of ultimately the only force at hand, I think that is sort of not paying attention enough to what's actually happening on the ground. And you see that in some of Gray's remarks around why it is that, these things weren't fully thought out, some things, the alternatives weren't in place. That is like, you're not paying attention to what's actually happening in the actual space that people actually allocating to alternatives. And indeed, not incidentally, it's been a talking point of the fossil fuel industry over the last year or two. You might have noticed the whole, we cannot dismantle fossil fuels overnight. Like, no one's talking about overnight. There are a few other points there, which will come back to the narcissism. It's a weird thing to say we don't matter, whoever we are. I find it a very unusual thing to say. It's, if you were in ancient Greece and you were a citizen and you were about to vote, to say, but you're just one out of hundreds or thousands of citizens. I mean, why even bother showing up? Clearly, your vote is rarely the tiebreaker. They would sort of be puzzled by that remark, right? It's like, what do you mean? Of course, we all matter. We all can contribute. We can make a difference. And something subtle, I think, has happened, maybe linked to the sort of economic mindset rolling more and more with this view of the marginal consumer and the marginal demand, which sort of marginalizes us all in a weird way. So to sort of imagine that it makes no difference what's happening in the West, some sort of thing, is weirdly politically, I think, a kind of defeatist stance. That's one point. It's weird from a technology's point of view, I think, not least because you again have this distinction between quote unquote the West and the rest in the climate discourse, whereby they're always barbarians at the gates, to use that phrase. There's always bad, dirty things happening overseas, abroad, as opposed to we here over here, quite clean. And I think that's a fake distinction. What happens in the West, there is, does reverberate in certain kinds of pioneering technologies and then doing a few other things like that. That does have a global impact. And there is also, of course, a kind of historical responsibility element. That's a much more contentious subject, but to just simply say, we started the Industrial Revolution here, the planet's boiling now, but whatever, now it's China's problem. When they get their act together, we'll be doing things. That's kind of disingenuous to me. And the final point, again, this whole talking point of Britain's only a fraction of global emissions. What about China and India? There's a lot happening in those places too. Yes, you hear about the coal plants that are being built in China all the time, but building a new coal plant doesn't mean you're running it. So I think the point is, that there's something unusual about sort of putting your hands up and saying, well, there's not that much we can do. Just because no one has the power to affect the entirety of world's emissions. That's the whole point. Each company, each country, each nation's try to pitch in as much as they can. And I think there is this expectation of leadership, not least in view of the historical role, right? To simply say, we're a big part of the cause in the past, but today it's got nothing to do with us. Sorry, talk to China. I think it's often a disingenuous argument. And not only does that miss what is actually happening on the ground, in China. People always talk about all the coal plants that are being built in China, but that's kind of the point. Adding new coal plants, yes, that doesn't mean proportionately you're burning as much coal. That's there's an underappreciated dynamic about what's happening in China, and they're building a lot more clean energy than they are coal. So that's picking up a lot more of the growth in power. There's a lot more happening overseas that is sometimes than people give credit to, and there's more progress happening here. And I've actually checked the numbers too. Germany used to have more than half of its electricity coming from coal. It was down to about 23% just before Ukraine and picked up to a third. The numbers are still lower, right? That's a kind of different point.
Got you. Yeah, okay. I suppose what John Gray might be arguing for, though, is in a world where, let's think about Western nations, highly impoverished, well, not impoverished, wrong word, highly indebted. The UK has a national debt higher than its GDP. Maybe this is actually a point that isn't totally linked. But the point he seems to be trying to make is that it costs an awful lot of money for the mitigation aspects of the way we're approaching net zero, i.e. all the changes in the supply chain and all those things. And he's saying if we're about to start getting hit by lots of bad weather or a changing climate, actually we'd be better off if we're only going to move the dial this much for 100 years' time to pour the resources that we have now into adapting for that changing climate, because actually the moment that the Chinese start to switch off their coal plants because they've built their big green and nuclear infrastructure, as it were, then the world immediately starts seeing the dial shift 100 years from that point. This is all totally pulling our figures out of the air. But you get where I'm coming from. I don't think he's saying don't do anything. He's basically saying, are we, based on our current contributions, putting our money in the right place?
Well, I don't know if that's not a false dilemma. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who is arguing you should choose between mitigation and adaptation on the climate sphere. But of course, if you don't think mitigation, then what you need to adapt to might be also very costly, right? If we don't get our act together, you need to adapt for much higher sea level rise than if you do. So there's a kind of complex interplay between the two. The debt point, sure, that's a big and important one. Whether or not it's occasionally used self-servingly, like if there's that phrase about debt being money we owe to ourselves over time. I mean, yes, of course, fiscal responsibility matters, but I don't know. The sort of there was actually parallel. I don't have the exact figures, but someone had compared the costs of building the railroads back in the Victorian time, and it didn't seem to be completely out of whack with some of the estimated costs around retooling some of the supply chains and sort of the investments needed for net zero. So, I don't know when that was sort of the Industrial Revolution was happening. I don't know how many people were talking about the budgets and the deficits, right? It's also a mindset issue. That's kind of the point on it. And yes, of course there are costs and there are upfront costs, but maybe the cost discussion, maybe the question is investment, not cost. There are upfront savings as well. So when the watchdogs at the International Energy Agency talk about how much does it cost, two things need to be put into perspective. You often hear these trillion numbers bandied about. We need to invest about 2 trillion every year to retool the energy system of the world. Okay, that may or may not be true. But what's less emphasized is that, we're already investing 1 trillion or so every time. It's not as if the alternative is no spending versus trillions. Yes, it's trillions and perhaps more, and how you direct them. And there are also savings. So, think of, in particular in the International Energy Agency's case, they do show that, some of these investments you make in technologies which have higher upfront capital costs, they cost more to install or to build, but have lower maintenance costs. You do start to see those dividends come in over time. So maybe say in 10 years or so, in 15 years, and then there's sort of models, you do start to see actually for the system as a whole, it becomes a less costly system. So what exactly is an investment and what is just a cost is an interesting debate here. I think there are indeed, the question of trade-offs isn't always presented upfront, but occasionally this discussion of the benefits and what's the alternative, right? Again, what is the alternative to not investing in any of these two sides of the coin, which is often where people who make some of these points, the fellow travelers of the what about China argument, they're not discussing about judiciously calibrating mitigation versus adaptation. They're saying this climate stuff, quote unquote, is making us all poorer. That is the kind of argument. And that's if not in bad faith, at least not in keeping with most facts, I would argue.
Well, there is much more we could do there to unpack it, but I feel like we are testing our connections and the demons in our machine to the very limit, Iancu, and I don't want to test your patience to the limit. So let's commit to having another conversation about this, and particularly when you end up writing and getting a deal for your book, Green Herrings, which I can't wait for. And if you want anyone to proofread it, well, not proofread it, but read it and offer comment, I would love to. But you're way smarter than me, so maybe trust your own judgment. And who knows, maybe one day we can get this platform, this podcast, Thinking Class, big enough that we can get my Northumbrian compatriot on, John Gray, and you two can have it out.
Thank you so much for all those wonderful ideas. I'll take you up on them.
Thank you, Iancu.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you so much again. Really enjoyed talking to you. And yeah, I hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.